The boarding call echoed through gate C-29 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, and most passengers barely looked up. But for one man, 76-year-old Walter Grady, it was more than just a routine announcement. It was the beginning of a journey he'd been planning for nearly 6 months. Walter moved slowly, carefully, the way men moved when time and service had shaped their bones. His right leg dragged slightly behind the other, a silent testimony to a war most people didn't even remember anymore. He wasn't dressed in military gear or demanding attention. Just a simple olive jacket over a white shirt, dark slacks, and a hat that bore the faded emblem of a long-retired Marine division. He had paid extra for seat 7C, an aisle seat with just enough legroom for his injury. That one detail mattered. The flight was a 5-hour trip to Charleston, where his son, a Navy officer himself, was retiring after 25 years of service. Walter wouldn't miss it for the world. Not after everything his family had given to this country. Not after everything it had taken from him. As he reached his seat and lowered himself gently, the pressure on his hip gave a familiar ache, not unbearable, but constant. He exhaled and offered a polite nod to the woman across the aisle, who gave him a distracted glance before returning to her phone. But peace never lasts long on a full flight. 3 rows ahead, a mild commotion was forming. A young mother stood beside a flight attendant, her voice hushed but pleading. 2 small children clung to her legs. She was gesturing toward the back of the plane, and then at her ticket. The flight attendant tapped at her tablet, then looked up. Her eyes scanned the cabin, then locked on Walter. She walked over, tablet in hand, a practiced smile on her face. "Sir," she said, polite but firm, "are you seated in 7C?" Walter nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. I booked it months ago. I need the space." "I understand completely," she replied, tone still calm. "But we have a family that's been separated during booking. The only way we can seat them together is by moving you. Just for this one flight." Walter furrowed his brow, politely but clearly taken aback. "Ma'am, I didn't just pick this seat for comfort. It's medical. That leg can't bend for long periods in tight spots. I've got a VA note, if that helps." The attendant's smile didn't falter. "I do understand, but unfortunately, there's no other option. If we can't seat this family, we'll be delayed." A pause. A long one. The air in the cabin started to shift. People were watching now, though pretending not to. A few turned their heads just slightly. One woman whispered something behind a magazine. Walter looked down at his folded hands. Scarred knuckles, swollen from arthritis, twitched slightly. He didn't want to be a problem. He didn't want to be that guy. But neither did he want to suffer for 5 hours in silence while some algorithm's mistake shoved him into a seat he hadn't agreed to. Still, the attendant waited. And silence pressed heavier. Then, quietly, Walter spoke. "If I say no, do I ground the flight?" She hesitated. "We prefer not to escalate." "I see," he said simply. And then he stood. Slowly. Painfully. He picked up his bag, nodded once to the attendant, and added, "For the record, I'm not refusing because I'm stubborn. I'm agreeing because I served 40 years ago and I know what happens when the needs of one man are weighed against the noise of many." The attendant didn't reply. She only gestured toward the rear of the plane. "Seat 32B," she said. "Middle seat. Back row. No legroom. No dignity." Walter limped his way down the aisle, passing rows of silent passengers. Not a single one looked him in the eye. Until he reached the very back, and sat between 2 strangers who barely moved their elbows to let him in. He didn't complain. He didn't sigh. He simply sat still, placed his bag under the seat, and rested his hands on his lap. What happened next, in the next 9 minutes, would shake the quiet of that cabin, and change every eye that had once looked away. Seat 32B wasn't just uncomfortable, it was punishing. Walter Grady shifted slightly, just enough to take the edge off the pain seeping down his right leg. The college student beside him had his earbuds in, bobbing his head to some song only he could hear. The other seat was occupied by a businessman scrolling through spreadsheets, barely noticing when Walter winced as his leg hit the tray support bar. Nobody cared. Nobody even offered a glance. That's how it usually went. You serve your country, give it your health and half your best years, and one day you're just an old man in a seat no one wants. But not everyone had looked away. 3 rows up, seat 19F, a woman in her mid-40s sat frozen. Her name was Angela Ruiz, and she worked as a senior customer liaison for Transcontinental Airlines. She wasn't in uniform today, just a navy blouse and slacks, flying home after a corporate meeting. She had watched it all, the awkward negotiation, the slow rise of the old man from the aisle seat, the limp, the silence, the stares. And it burned a hole through her. Angela wasn't prone to anger, but something about this moment stuck. She pulled out her phone and typed out a message to the head of Flight Ops, marked urgent. Passenger Walter Grady, seat 32B. Moved from aisle 7C due to seating shuffle. Veteran. Confirmed mobility issue. Cabin crew dismissive. Please flag. Flight TC-841. ETA Charleston. She hit send and stared out the window. She didn't know if anyone would act. But she couldn't sit still. Not after what she saw. Meanwhile, Walter sat in that tight space, shoulders pulled in, hands clenched together. He wasn't bitter. He'd lived long enough to know that kindness was often optional and rarely guaranteed. But his leg throbbed in a slow rhythm that made him close his eyes and breathe carefully. He heard the rustle of the seatbelt demonstration, the click of overhead bins, the hum of final preparations. The flight attendants were moving down the aisle, checking bags and trays. None of them stopped to acknowledge him. The businessman beside him shifted again, claiming even more elbow room. The college kid never looked up. Walter stared at the seat in front of him and thought 5 hours. Just make it through 5 hours. But then, a ding echoed through the cockpit. An alert on the co-pilot's screen. Captain David Lancaster had just finished the pre-flight checks when he noticed the message. His eyes narrowed. He tapped the screen. Passenger alert, Walter Grady. Veteran. Relocated from aisle seat 7C. Medical need flagged. Respond per discretion. David's fingers froze. Walter Grady. That name wasn't familiar in the way you remember a colleague. It was familiar in the way legends are whispered. David had once read an old article about a Marine named Walter Grady who dragged 2 wounded men out of a jungle clearing under heavy fire. It had stuck with him. He didn't know if this was the same man. But something in his gut told him it was. Hold the gate, he said, snapping off his harness. Tell ground control we're delaying for a passenger concern. The co-pilot looked puzzled. Everything okay? Not yet, David said. He stood, straightened the cuffs of his uniform, and stepped out of the cockpit. The energy in the cabin shifted the second he walked out. The uniform always had that effect. But this wasn't a routine walk. He didn't say a word. He moved past first class. Then business. Then economy. Angela saw him coming and immediately leaned into the aisle, nodding once. Their eyes met. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. David continued walking. Row after row until he reached 32B. Walter looked up, startled by the sudden shadow falling across him. The moment their eyes met, Walter sat straighter. And then, in front of every passenger on that plane, Captain David Lancaster raised his right hand and delivered a formal military salute. A full, crisp, proper salute. The cabin fell utterly silent. Walter blinked, confused. Captain. David nodded. Staff Sergeant Grady, sir. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today. This should never have happened. We're going to make this right. Walter sat frozen. Every passenger now leaned slightly forward. The flight, already 5 minutes late, had stopped for one man. And yet not a single person seemed to mind. The silence after Captain Lancaster's salute was not awkward, it was reverent. For a moment, no one breathed. No one blinked. Walter Grady looked up at the man before him, the flight captain standing tall, his hands still held in a proper salute, his face solemn and resolute. Walter's voice caught in his throat. "Captain, you don't have to." But David Lancaster lowered his salute only to gently place a hand on Walter's shoulder. "I insist," he said. "And it's not a gesture. It's a correction." He turned to the flight attendants. "Ms. Blake," he said, addressing the very woman who had ordered Walter to move. Kayla Blake, still clutching her tablet like a lifeline, stepped forward, her face now pale, voice gone tight. "Yes, Captain. You will escort Mr. Grady to seat 1A in the front of this aircraft. First class," David said. "And if it's taken, ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, make it clear that the request is coming from the captain of this flight, on behalf of a veteran who gave far more than any of us." The businessman sitting next to Walter shot upright before the attendant could even blink. "Take my seat," he said. "Please." Kayla blinked. "Sir? I'm serious," the man said. "Take it." "I shouldn't have said nothing when he sat down." David nodded. "Thank you." Walter tried to stand, slowly and carefully. His legs stiffened in resistance, but he braced himself on the armrest. Kayla moved to assist, but David raised a hand. "I've got him." He took Walter gently by the elbow and helped him up. Angela Rees stood now too, watching from her seat, her eyes moist. And as Walter stepped out into the aisle, something extraordinary began to happen. A man in row 31 stood up and stepped aside. Then a woman in 30 did the same. One by one, passengers along the aisle moved back, creating a clear path forward, not because anyone asked them to, but because something inside told them it was the right thing to do. They weren't just making space for a man. They were making space for a moment. Walter limped forward slowly. His walk wasn't proud, but it was sure. And as he passed each row, heads turned. A few nodded. A few whispered. One older man in 26C removed his baseball cap and pressed it to his chest. And then a voice. From midway down the aisle. "Staff Sergeant Grady?" Walter turned, startled. A man in his late 30s stood up, clean-shaven, sturdy, jeans and a hoodie. His voice trembled. "You probably don't remember me, sir. Camp Leatherneck. I was PFC Daniels. You dragged me behind cover in 04. Walter stopped. His eyes narrowed, searching. Then they widened. "Daniels," he said quietly. "Your arm." "Yeah," Daniels said, choking on the word. "They saved it. I never got to say thank you." Walter blinked hard, and nodded once. "You just did." The whole plane was quiet again. This time, it wasn't just out of respect, it was out of something deeper. Recognition. The old man they had almost overlooked was now someone else. Someone they wished they had seen the moment he boarded. By the time Walter reached the front of the plane, the man in 1A had already vacated the seat. He stepped aside with a simple, "Sir, it's yours." With respect. Walter settled slowly into the plush seat. First class. Wide armrests. Stretchable legroom. No bumping elbows. No tray bars pressing into knees. But what mattered more than the seat was the dignity of it. The silence that had followed him now shifted again. This time, it broke. Applause. Real applause. Slow, steady rising. David Lancaster turned to the cabin. "Let's be very clear," he said, loud enough for every ear. "No aircraft I command will ever leave the gate while disrespect remains seated in one of our rows." He locked eyes with Kayla Blake, who stood stunned and ashamed. "Understood?" he said. She nodded. "Yes, Captain." Angela Rees finally reached for her phone, not to send a message, but to capture the moment. The standing ovation. The humbled silence. The captain still at Walter's side. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel. Sometimes it just needs someone to stand up, turn around, and say, "This isn't right." And sometimes, that's all it takes to make it right. By the time the plane lifted off from the tarmac, the energy in the cabin had changed completely. Not because anything grand had been said over the intercom again. Captain Lancaster had returned to the cockpit without fanfare, but because something sacred had taken place in the space between takeoff instructions and taxi clearance. People were quieter now. The usual shuffling of bags, the clack of tray tables, the impatient sighs, they weren't there. In seat 1A, Walter sat with a quiet he hadn't known in years. Not the lonely quiet of being overlooked. Not the weary quiet of pain he didn't want to burden others with. No, this was peace. A flight attendant brought him water and a real glass. Another offered him a blanket. But it wasn't the small gestures that stayed with him, it was the look in their eyes. He gently rested his hand over his knee, the same leg that had made life a series of calculated steps and compromises. But right now, stretched out with comfort and care, it didn't ache like before. For the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to relax. Behind him, Charlotte Hayes sat still, her phone forgotten in her lap. She watched the landscape through the oval window, clouds tumbling below like whispers. Her hands were folded, but her mind was racing. She'd seen things like this before, kindness in flashes, justice in brief glimpses, but this one felt different. This felt like it needed to be told. And she would tell it. But not with hashtags. Not with outrage or opinion. Just the story, as it happened. Because truth, when carried with dignity, didn't need to be polished. She pulled out her laptop. And she began to write. When the plane landed in Phoenix just past 3 p.m., there was no announcement, no red carpet. But when the seatbelt sign dinged off and the passengers began to rise, a few of them did something unexpected. They didn't rush to grab their bags. They turned to Walter Grady. "Sir," one young man said softly, "thank you for your service." A woman 2 rows back touched his shoulder as she passed. An older gentleman in row 4 simply nodded and whispered, "Semper Fi." Walter, caught off guard, smiled in return. Not a forced smile. A real one. When he finally stood, it was slow and careful, but the stiffness in his knees wasn't quite as cruel now. At the gate, Angela Rees was waiting. Clipboard in hand, she wasn't smiling. But she wasn't angry either. She stepped forward, lips pressed into a line. "Mr. Grady," she said. "On behalf of Gate 27 and Transamerican Airlines, I owe you an apology." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You already gave me one." "No," she said. "That was the easy one. This one's official. I filed an incident report. I'll make sure the record shows you were moved against both policy and medical recommendation." She paused. "And Mr. Grady, your name, and what happened today, will go to our internal policy board. I'll see to it myself." Walter nodded once. "Thank you." Angela reached into her folder and handed him a small card. It was white with gold print. "Veteran Guest of Honor," it read. "No more fees," she said. "No more seating struggles. Just let us know when you fly. We'll take care of it." He looked at the card for a long time. "I'm not used to being remembered," he said. "Well," Angela replied, "maybe it's time we all get better at remembering." 3 days later, Walter Grady was back home in Tucson. The sun was warm on his porch. A breeze carried the scent of desert sage. He sat in his old wooden rocker, the one that creaked when he leaned too far back, and stared out at the low hills. A package sat on the small table beside him. It had arrived that morning. From the Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside, a copy of the news article from Charlotte Hayes. A short handwritten note from Captain David Lancaster. And a formal invitation. Veteran Recognition Ceremony. Joint Base Andrews, Guest of Honor, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, Ret. Walter read it twice. And then, for the first time in a long time, he laughed. Not a sad laugh. Not a bitter one. A real, full-bellied laugh. And he whispered to no one in particular, "Well, I guess that middle seat did have a purpose after all." Sometimes the smallest decisions ripple the widest. A forced seat change. A reluctant nod. A man standing up, literally and figuratively, to say, "Enough." and in the span of 9 minutes, a flight was delayed. But a man's dignity was restored. So the next time you see someone alone, quiet, unassuming, look closer. You might be staring at a story worth telling.